The wagon rolled into Harlan Crossing just after 2 in the afternoon, when the Montana sun sat high and mean in a white sky with no clouds to soften it, the kind of heat that made the air shimmer off the dirt road like something alive. Evelyn Hartwell sat in the back of the freight wagon with her trunk wedged against her knees and her good traveling dress damp at the collar, watching the settlement take shape as they came down from the ridge. It wasn't much. She had known it wouldn't be much. She'd read Marcus Webb's letters enough times to have them nearly memorized, and he had been honest, at least, about the roughness of the place. Small but growing, he'd written. Not like St. Louis, but honest, and with room to build something real. She had read those words on a February night in her sister's kitchen in Missouri, with the smell of boiled potatoes in the air and the sound of her brother-in-law snoring through the wall, and she had thought, room to build something real sounds exactly like what I need. That was 4 months ago. That version of herself felt like a stranger now. The wagon driver, a heavy-set man named Arlo, who had barely spoken 20 words the entire 2-day journey from Billings, pulled the horses up in front of a building with a hand-painted sign that read, General Store and Post. He climbed down without looking at her. End of the line, he said. Evelyn climbed down herself because no one offered to help, and stood in the street with her trunk at her feet. The heat pressed down like a hand. Around her, Harlan Crossing went about its business. A woman hanging laundry outside a low building to the left, 2 men talking near a hitching post, a dog sleeping in the only available patch of shade. Nobody looked at her for more than a second. She had written to Marcus Webb 3 weeks ago, when she had her departure date confirmed, giving him the exact day and approximate hour of her arrival. She had asked him to meet her at the general store, which was the only landmark she could identify from his descriptions. She had received no reply, but the letter hadn't left much time for one, and she had told herself that was fine. He would be here. He was not here. She waited 20 minutes before going inside. The store was dim and smelled of sawdust and tobacco. A man behind the counter, lean, 60s, with a gray beard trimmed close, looked up when she came in. Help you? I'm looking for Marcus Webb, she said. He's a rancher, about 12 miles east of here, I believe. I was supposed to meet him today. The man's expression shifted. Not much, but enough. Something closed off in it, the way a shutter closes against weather. You Evelyn Hartwell? He said. She felt a small, cold thing pass through her chest. I am. He turned around and took an envelope from a shelf behind him. He set it on the counter between them with the careful movements of a man who wants nothing to do with what's inside. He came by 4 days ago, the man said. Asked me to hold this for a woman matching your description, arriving on the freight wagon from Billings. He paused. I'm Chester Holt. I own this store. She picked up the envelope. Her name was written on the front in a hand she recognized from 6 months of letters. She opened it at the counter because her legs weren't entirely steady, and she didn't want to be sitting down when she read it. It was short. That was the first thing she noticed. 3 months of correspondence, planning, sacrifice, and he had given her 8 sentences. Miss Hartwell, I owe you an explanation I am not sure how to give. I have made arrangements to leave Montana Territory. It is not something I expected to have to tell you, and I understand if you find this unacceptable. A circumstance has arisen that makes my continued presence here untenable. I cannot in good conscience ask you to join me in what lies ahead, which is uncertain at best. I am sorry to have put you in this position. I have left $20 with Mr. Holt to help with your return journey, as I understand it is my responsibility to see to that much at least. Respectfully, Marcus Webb. She read it twice. Then she folded it along its original crease and put it back in the envelope. He left money, Chester Holt said. He was looking somewhere past her left shoulder. $20. You want it? Not yet, she said. She turned and walked back outside because she needed air and she needed to not be standing in front of a witness. She walked to the far side of the wagon, which was still sitting where Arlo had left it, and she put both hands on the sideboards and looked down at the dirt between her feet, and she breathed, in and out. The heat pressed at the back of her neck. Somewhere behind her, she heard a door open and close. She was 33 years old. She had spent most of the last decade being careful. Careful with money, careful with decisions, careful with hopes, because careful was what kept you from catastrophe. And then last winter she had decided, for what felt like excellent reasons at the time, to stop being careful. She had sold her half of the seamstress shop she owned with her friend Dora Finch. She had sold her furniture. She had purchased a one-way ticket west, because buying a return ticket would have felt like admitting she expected to fail. She had no return ticket. She had $31 because Marcus Webb's conscience had covered 20 of it, and she had 11 of her own. She had a trunk containing 3 dresses, 2 pairs of boots, a wool blanket, a set of good scissors, her mother's Bible, which she kept more out of habit than anything else, a box of thread and needles, 6 months' worth of letters from a man she had never met, and a silver locket with a photograph inside of a face she no longer wanted to look at. The dog she'd noticed earlier had relocated from its shade patch and was now sitting about 10 feet away, watching her with amber eyes. "Don't look at me like that," she said. The dog's ears moved, but it didn't look away. She pushed off the wagon. She straightened her back and walked back into Chester Holt's store, and she took the $20 from him because she was not so proud that she would refuse money she needed, and she asked him where a person might find a room for the night. The room was $8 a week at a place called the Caldwell House, which was neither a hotel nor a boarding house in any formal sense, but rather a large structure owned by a widow named Patrice Caldwell, who rented out 2 upstairs rooms when the need arose. The need arose more often than one might expect, Patrice said. Montana Territory had a way of stranding people. Evelyn paid for 2 nights. That gave her time to think. She sat on the narrow bed in the upstairs room with the window open and the thin curtain moving in what passed for a breeze, and she laid out her situation with the same methodical care she'd used to assess the seamstress shop's monthly accounts. What she had, what she owed, what her options were. What she had, $33 after the room, a trunk of clothes, skills with a needle that had once been enough to support herself, and enough stubbornness to have gotten herself across 800 miles of the American interior alone. What she owed, nothing, which was something. Marcus Webb had been decent enough not to take anything from her beyond her time. What her options were, that was the hard one. She could take the $33 and buy passage back to Missouri and return to St. Louis with no shop, no savings, no particular story she wanted to tell anyone, and the specific private shame of a woman who had done something bold and had it come apart in her hands. Or she could stay. The problem with staying was the immediate and practical one. She had $33 in the hardest territory she had ever seen, in a settlement she didn't know, where she had no connections, no family, and no plan beyond what had just dissolved. She lay back on the bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about this for a long time. She was not a woman given to crying. She had cried twice in the last decade, once when her mother died, and once when her friendship with Dora Finch quietly collapsed over money disagreements, which was a kind of death too. She did not cry now. She lay on the bed in Harlan Crossing, Montana Territory, while the heat of the day thinned toward evening, and she thought about what she was actually capable of. Quite a lot, she had always suspected. She had simply never had occasion to find out how much. The second morning, she went back to Chester Holt's store. She was there when he unlocked the door at 7, and she asked him plainly and without embarrassment to tell her what the employment situation in and around Harlan Crossing looked like for a woman with strong sewing skills and a willingness to work. Chester Holt was not an unkind man. She was beginning to understand. He had simply been uncomfortable the previous afternoon, which was understandable. He scratched the back of his neck and thought about it. "Mrs. Patterson might take on a seamstress," he said. "She does alterations and some dressmaking, but she's getting older and her eyes give her trouble." He paused. "Other than that, the Caldwell house sometimes needs help with laundry. Patrice Caldwell isn't particular about the work, just that it gets done." "Who else comes through here regularly?" she asked. "Ranchers, farmers, anyone who might need sewing or mending done?" "Any number of them," he said. "Most of the wives do it themselves, or go without, but there are plenty of men working land alone who've got clothing in sorry shape." She thought about that. "Could I put up a notice in here?" "Be my guest." She bought a piece of paper and a pencil stub for 2 cents and wrote out a card at the counter. Skilled seamstress. Mending, alterations, dressmaking, reasonable rates. Ask at Caldwell House for E. Hartwell. Chester Holt tacked it to the board near the door without being asked. She was walking back out when a man came in, and they nearly collided in the doorway. He stepped back. She stepped back. They looked at each other for a moment. He was somewhere in his late 30s, she guessed, with a face that had been thoroughly worked over by weather. Not unpleasant, but lived in, the way faces get when they spend more time outdoors than in. Dark eyes. A jaw that could have used a razor 2 days ago. He was tall, and he moved like a man who wasn't accustomed to having anyone in his way, but not aggressively, more like someone used to mostly empty spaces. "Sorry," he said. He had a low voice. Not unfriendly. "No, I wasn't watching," she said. He went inside. She went out. That was all. She found out his name that evening at Patrice Caldwell's supper table. Patrice ran a tight household and expected guests to eat with her if they were renting a room, which Evelyn didn't mind. There were 2 other temporary boarders at the table, a land surveyor named Gibbs, who was mostly quiet, and a traveling merchant named Foley, who was not quiet at all. "Colton Hayes," Patrice said when Evelyn described the man in the doorway. She passed the potato dish without being asked. "He's got a ranch about 8 miles out. Good land, or it was before the drought took hold. Been running it alone since his hired man left last spring." "He seems like he keeps to himself," Evelyn said. "He does," Patrice agreed, "but he's not a difficult man. Just not one for company." She looked at Evelyn with the specific, assessing look of a woman who has watched many people come through and learned to read them quickly. "How long are you planning to stay, Miss Hartwell?" The question was genuine, not unkind. "I haven't decided yet," Evelyn said, which was honest. She was still deciding. She had been in Harlan Crossing for 4 days when Colton Hayes came back. She was in front of Chester Holt's store, talking to a woman named Ruth Abernethy about a skirt hem that needed dropping, when she noticed him across the street loading supplies into a wagon. He moved with a certain economy, not hurried, not lazy, just efficient, like a man who had made peace with the amount of work there was to do in the world. She finished her conversation with Ruth Abernethy, who agreed to bring the skirt by the Caldwell house the following morning and would pay 50 cents for the work. 50 cents was not going to solve anything, but it was 50 cents she hadn't had. She was about to go back inside when Hayes's horse, a big bay that had been tied loosely to the post, decided it had opinions about the wagon wheel scraping against the ground during loading and startled sideways hard enough to pull the post loose at the base. The horse didn't bolt, but it danced backward in the street with enough force to scatter 2 other horses and bring a woman and her small child scrambling off the boardwalk. Hayes caught the lead line before it was fully gone. He didn't shout, didn't do anything dramatic, just moved fast and got hold of the horse's head and spoke to it in a low, steady voice that Evelyn could hear from 20 feet away, even though she couldn't make out the words. The horse settled. The other horses settled. The woman picked up her child. Everything returned to its prior state in about 90 seconds. He looked up and caught Evelyn watching him. She looked away first, which she immediately felt was unnecessary. She had been watching because it was an interesting thing to watch. There was nothing to be embarrassed about. That evening, he came into the Caldwell house. Patrice met him in the front room. Evelyn was at the table with her mending. Ruth Abernethy had dropped the skirt by early, and she could hear the conversation, which was short. "You hear about the Webb woman?" he asked. "She's right here," Patrice said, without any drama whatsoever. A pause. Then, "Could I speak with her?" Evelyn set down the skirt. He came into the room. His hat was in his hands, which she noticed. He stopped at a respectful distance and looked at her directly, which she also noticed. "Miss Hartwell," he said, "I'm Colton Hayes. I've got a ranch east of here." "I know who you are," she said. "Sit down if you'd like." He sat, not comfortably. He held himself like a man who wasn't accustomed to sitting in other people's houses. But he sat. "I heard what happened with Webb," he said. "I'm not here to pry. I just want to say what I came to say, and then leave you to your business." "Go ahead." He looked at his hat for a moment, then back at her. "I need help on the ranch. Honest work. Cooking, keeping the house in some kind of order, and whatever else comes up. It's not comfortable living. The house is plain and the work is hard, and I can't promise anything beyond room and meals and a fair wage." He paused. "I know it's not what you came here for, but you seem like you're figuring out your options, and I thought you should know this one exists." The room was quiet. Somewhere in the back of the house, a pot clanged. Evelyn looked at him. She thought about the $308 she'd gotten for her half of the seamstress shop, the 50 cents she'd earned today, the $11 gap in the week's rent if she didn't produce more work. "What's the wage?" she asked. $5 a month, and I know that's not much, but you'd have a roof and food, and that's real. She did the arithmetic. It wasn't impressive, but neither was her alternative. Why are you doing this? She said. You don't know anything about me. He didn't answer immediately. She appreciated that. He wasn't a man who reached for easy answers. Webb made a commitment and didn't honor it, he said finally. That's between him and his conscience. But you came all this way on the strength of his word, and you're stranded. That's not right. He turned his hat once in his hands. And I do need the help. So it's not charity. I want that to be clear. It's clear, she said. She thought about it for another moment. I'll need 2 days to consider it, she said. I have some work here in town that I'm finishing. He nodded. That's fair. He stood. Ask Chester Holt if you want to know anything about me. He'll tell you what's true. He put his hat back on. Good evening, Miss Hartwell. Good evening, she said. After he left, Patrice appeared in the doorway with a dish towel over one arm and the expression of a woman who had been listening and was not ashamed of it. He's not a complicated man, Patrice said. He says what he means. He doesn't always say much, but what comes out of his mouth, you can generally rely on. That's more than can be said for some, Evelyn said, and picked up the skirt again. She asked Chester Holt. She also asked the woman at the post office, whose name was Agnes, and she asked Ruth Abernethy when she came to pick up the finished skirt, and she even asked the traveling merchant Foley, who had ranged across the territory for years and knew most of the active landholders, at least by name. The answers were consistent. Colton Hayes had ranched the property for 9 years. He'd bought it from a man who wanted to leave. He kept his debt settled and didn't make trouble with neighbors. He had hired men in better years and let them go without disputes when he couldn't afford them. He was quiet, worked hard, and had a reputation for honesty that every person she asked confirmed without hesitation. Nobody knew much about his personal life, and nobody pressed him on it. That was the picture of a man who had made himself self-sufficient to the point of having very little friction with the world around him. She thought about what it would mean to go out to that ranch. She was clear-eyed about it. She wasn't going because she believed any story about what might develop between them. She was going because she had skills, and he had a need, and because staying in Harlan Crossing, spending $30 a month on a rented room while waiting for enough mending work to appear was a plan with a floor she didn't like. She was 33 years old, and she had come to Montana Territory for the frontier. She had just been wrong about which particular part of it she'd be confronting. Oh, she told him yes on the morning of the third day. He arrived at the Caldwell house at 8, as she'd asked, and he was on time, and he brought a second horse because he'd correctly assumed she couldn't drive a wagon. He tied her trunk behind his saddle and helped her mount without making anything of it. They rode east. The land that opened up past the settlement was nothing like Missouri. Missouri had a settled, generous look. Soft hills, green even in summer, the sense of a landscape that had long since decided to cooperate with the people living on it. Montana Territory did not look cooperative. It looked indifferent, which was in some ways worse. The grass was sparse and yellowed at this time of year, bleached by a sun that had been too consistent for too long. The ground was hard and cracked in places, and the hills were big and bare and held no promise, only scale. She didn't say any of this. She looked at it, and she noted it, and she kept riding. How long has the drought been? She asked, when they'd been riding for an hour. Coming on 8 weeks with nothing meaningful, he said. He was riding a few feet ahead and turned slightly to answer her. Lost 2/3 of my hay crop. The cattle are thin. How many head? He glanced back at her, a brief look she couldn't quite read. 63, he said. Had 90 in better years. What do you need to come back from that? Another glance. Rain, he said, and time, and not losing any more. That sounds like most things, she said. He almost smiled. She saw the edge of it before he turned back to face the trail. The ranch house was low and square and had the look of something built for function and never touched again. 2 rooms visible from outside, a covered porch that leaned slightly south, a fence line that had been repaired so many times in so many places it looked like a quilt. Behind the house, a barn in better shape than the house itself, which told her something about him. A kitchen garden that was just barely surviving, the plants thin and pale, leaning toward the trough as if they knew what they needed and were waiting for it. He got her trunk down and carried it inside without ceremony. The interior was as plain as the outside. A main room with a table, 2 chairs, a stone fireplace with a cast iron stove set into it, a narrow kitchen area along the back wall, a second door that led, she assumed, to his sleeping room. The walls were bare. The floor was swept clean. There was nothing decorative anywhere. Not a picture, not a curtain, not even a rough mat by the door. Just the tools of living, arranged neatly. "Your room's through here," he said, and pushed open a door she hadn't noticed set into the side wall, which opened into a lean-to addition. It was small, barely enough for a cot and a chest and a hook on the wall, but it had its own door to the outside and a single window, and it was private, which she valued. "The cot's new," he said, as if this required explanation. "I bought it in town 2 days ago." She looked at the cot. It was, as promised, new. The wood still had the look of something recently cut. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and withdrew, and she was left alone in the small room with her trunk and the sound of boots crossing the main room floor, and then the front door opening and closing. And she understood that they were going to begin. She made mistakes at first. She was not going to pretend otherwise. She miscalculated the wood needed for the stove and burned the first pan of biscuits to stone. She didn't know how to work the water pump, and the first time she tried it, she soaked her dress and the front step and everything within a 3-foot radius. She opened the wrong gate in the fence line, and 3 of the calves got through before she managed to drive them back, which took 45 minutes and left her winded and furious with herself. Colton Hayes said almost nothing about any of this. He showed her how the pump worked, once, clearly, without condescension, and fixed the gate without commentary. When she produced supper from what was available in the kitchen, which wasn't much, he ate it without complaint. "I don't know how to do most of what will be expected of me here," she told him on that first evening. She thought it was better to say this directly. "I can sew, and I can cook reasonably well in a normal kitchen, and I can manage accounts, but I don't know ranch work." He looked at her across the table. The lamp between them made the room warmer than it was. "Can you learn?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Then that's enough for now," he said. She wanted to ask him something else, about what he expected, about where the lines were, about how this arrangement was supposed to work in the practical daily sense. But she stopped herself. She was a capable woman in an unfamiliar place. The questions would get answered by the doing. She cleared the table. She washed the dishes in the basin. She went to her room and lay on the new cot and listened to Montana at night, which was different from any night sound she'd known before. Vast and close at the same time, full of wind and the movement of grass and the faraway sound of cattle, and something else she couldn't name, something that was just the sheer size of the territory making itself known in the dark. She was not comfortable. She was not happy, exactly. She was not afraid. She was present, which was different from all of them, and which felt strangely like a beginning. The first real test came on the 4th day. She had gotten better with the pump. She had produced 2 serviceable meals and 1 genuinely good one, a pan of cornbread that had come out right on the 3rd attempt, and a bean soup that worked because beans didn't require much coaxing. She had found where he kept the mending and had done 3 weeks' worth of it in an afternoon, which appeared to genuinely surprise him, though he didn't say so directly. On the 4th day, one of the cattle, a heifer, that had been looking poorly since before Evelyn arrived, went down in the east pasture. She saw it from the kitchen window and didn't know what it meant exactly, but she knew it wasn't right. She went out. Hayes was already there by the time she crossed the pasture. He was crouching beside the animal, checking its eyes and its breathing, running his hands along its belly. Evelyn stopped a few feet back and watched. The heifer was breathing too fast and her sides were heaving. "What can I do?" she asked. He didn't look up immediately. "Go to the barn. Right side. On the shelf above the workbench, there's a tin box, wooden handle, looks like a small saw case. Bring it." She went and came back in 4 minutes with the box. He worked over the next hour without talking much. She stayed. She handed him what he asked for. She didn't flinch at the parts that were not clean or pleasant because flinching wasn't useful and she didn't have the luxury of it. The heifer was in some kind of distress that she didn't understand the specifics of, and Hayes worked with a focused, quiet competence that she found, in the abstract, in the way you can notice something at a distance from yourself, genuinely impressive. The heifer survived. It was touch and go for a while, and she understood from his expression when it turned that he hadn't been certain it would. When it was over and he stood up, he looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him yet. Not quite surprise, more like reassessment. "You've got a steady hand," he said. "I've done a lot of close work," she said. "Needlework. It teaches you to be still." He nodded slowly. He looked back at the heifer, who was on her feet now, breathing easier. "I appreciate it," he said. "The help." "I live here," she said. "At least for now, I'm not going to watch from the window." He looked at her again. There was something in his face that she thought might have been, under different circumstances and a great deal more ease between them, amusement. But he just nodded. "Fair enough," he said. They walked back to the house in the last of the afternoon light, the grass pale and the sky immense, and the distant hills going blue in the evening air, and Evelyn Hartwell thought, "I am not going back." It was not a decision she made carefully, with a list of reasons. It arrived all at once, the way real decisions sometimes do. Not from thinking, but from something below thinking. She was not going back. Whatever was here, the hard ground, the impossible sky, the work she didn't know yet, the quiet man who said what he meant, she was not going back from it. She went inside and started supper. 3 weeks passed. The drought continued. The cattle grew thinner. Evelyn grew more capable, incrementally and through the reliable method of doing things badly until she could do them adequately. She learned the pump. She learned the stove's temperament, which was considerable. She learned which of the cattle Hayes was most concerned about and why. And she learned to read the sky the way he did. Not with confidence, because that took years, but with attention, which was a start. She also kept her hand in the sewing. She sent word back to Harlan Crossing through Hayes on his supply runs that she was available for work, and small parcels began arriving. A shirt with a torn shoulder seam, 2 pairs of trousers needing patching, a boy's coat that had outgrown its buttons. The work was slow and the pay was small, but it was hers. They developed a way of being around each other that functioned. They were not easy together, not yet. There was too much unknown for ease, but they were not awkward either exactly. They were 2 people doing work in the same space, and the work was the common language. And for now, that was enough. One evening, she came in from hanging laundry to find him at the table with a ledger open and his face set in the particular way people's faces set when the numbers don't cooperate. She got 2 cups of coffee. She had learned that he took it without anything, and set one in front of him and sat down across from him without asking. He looked up. "Bad?" she asked. "Not good," he said. "Webb's land to the north has been sitting idle since he left. Someone from outside the territory has put in a claim on it. If they get it, they'll control the water rights on the creek. And that affects you." "It affects everyone south and east of the creek," he said, "but me most directly." He turned the ledger slightly so she could see, which she took as an invitation. "My cattle need that water. If a new owner charges for it or diverts it, the whole operation breaks." She looked at the numbers. They were not good numbers. The drought had already carved out a meaningful deficit, and there was a note from the bank in Billings folded inside the ledger cover that she'd seen him reading twice. "When do they rule on the claim?" she asked. "Government surveyors are supposed to come through before winter," he said. "Settle outstanding land questions in this area. But that's 3, maybe 4 months. And until then?" He picked up his coffee. "Until then, I keep the cattle alive and the bank patient and hope the creek doesn't run dry." She looked at the ledger again, then at him. "You should have me start keeping these," she said. "The accounts." He paused. "I managed my own business in Missouri for 6 years," she said. "I know what I'm doing with numbers. No point leaving it to chance when there's someone here who can do it properly." He studied her for a moment. "All right," he said. It was that simple. She pulled the ledger toward her, turned to the first page, and started from the beginning. They sat at the table with the lamp between them until nearly 10 o'clock, and she went through the accounts with the same precision she'd always brought to this kind of work, asking questions when she needed them and not when she didn't, and he answered them without hedging. By the time she closed the ledger, she had a clear picture of where they stood, and it was hard, but it was not impossible. "You're not as far under as I thought from the first look," she said. "That's more than I expected you to say," he said. "You've been spending carefully. You haven't let anything frivolous through." She pushed the ledger back across the table. "The problem isn't spending, it's production, and the drought controls most of that." He nodded. He was quiet for a moment, turning his cup slowly on the table. You came a long way, he said, to end up keeping books on a failing cattle operation. It's not failing yet, she said, and I didn't end up here by accident. I made a choice. Webb. I'm not talking about Webb, she said. I made a choice to stay in Harlan Crossing. I made a choice to take this position. Nobody made those for me. He looked at her. The lamp between them threw the shadows of the room back against the walls. No, he said after a moment. I suppose they didn't. Outside, the wind had come up, which was new. For the past 3 weeks, the air had been dead still and hot, and this felt different. She glanced at the window. Does that wind mean something? She asked. He stood and went to the door and opened it and stood on the porch for a long moment. She followed because she was curious and because she was learning to read the land through him, at least until she could read it herself. The night was thick with the smell of something. Not rain, not yet, but the memory of rain. The suggestion of it carried on a wind that came from the north and moved the dry grass in long, visible waves. Maybe, he said. Maybe not. How long has it been since you hoped for something? She asked. She wasn't sure why she asked it. It came out before she could decide not to. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Long enough, he said finally, that I've gotten out of the habit. She thought about that. She looked at the dark land and the darker sky and the stars that were too many and too close, the way they always were out here. Nothing between them and you. Well, she said, maybe it's time to get back into it. She went inside. She went to her room. She lay on the cot in the dark and listened to the wind moving across the territory, and she was still not comfortable, and she was still not happy in any simple sense, but something in her chest had settled into something that felt, cautiously and with no promises attached, like it might become a life. In the morning, the sky was still dry, but the wind had stayed, and Evelyn Hartwell, who had arrived with nothing and been left with less, set her feet on the floorboards and stood up and went to start the stove. The wind that had moved through in the night left nothing behind but the memory of itself. Morning came dry and pale, the sky the color of old bone, and Evelyn was at the stove before the sun had fully cleared the hills. She had learned its temperament by now, the way it ran hot on the left side and needed the damper adjusted twice before it settled. And she worked around its moods the way you work around the moods of anything you can't replace. Hayes was already in the barn when she went out to call him for breakfast. She could hear him moving in there, the low sound of his voice talking to the horses the way he sometimes did, not in full sentences, but in the short, reassuring sounds people make when they want something to know it's not alone. She stood in the doorway of the barn for a moment without announcing herself. The bay horse, the one that had startled in town the week before, had its ears forward and its head turned toward him, and Hayes was running a hand along its neck without looking at it, checking the shoe on its left forefoot with his other hand. "Breakfast," she said. He straightened. 5 minutes. She went back inside. They had settled into a morning routine without ever discussing one. He was out at first light. She had the stove going and something edible on the table before the sun was fully up. They ate without much conversation because neither of them were people who needed to fill silence, and because there was usually enough work pressing on both of them to make idle talk feel like something they couldn't afford. This morning, though, he looked at the sky through the window for a long time before he picked up his fork. "I'm going to move the cattle to the north pasture today," he said. "The grass there isn't much, but the ground holds moisture longer. Might be something left that the south field's given up on." "How many are you moving?" "All of them that can make the walk." He was still looking at the sky. "The 3 that are weakest I'll leave closer to the barn. I want to be able to watch them. I'll check on them through the day," she said. He looked at her then, the brief direct look she had gotten used to from him. Not suspicious, just assessing, like a man who took nothing for granted and preferred to verify his information. "You sure you can tell if something's wrong?" She thought of the heifer 10 days ago, the way she'd learned to watch for the breathing pattern, the position of the ears, the particular way an animal holds its body when it's in pain versus when it's merely uncomfortable. "I'm not sure," she said, "but I'm learning." He seemed to accept that. He finished his breakfast, rinsed his own plate. He had always done that, she'd noticed, from the first day without any comment about it, and went out. She cleared the table and assessed what they had in the kitchen, which was not abundant. The supply run to Harlan Crossing was 3 days out. She had enough flour, enough dried beans, enough salt pork that she could work with. What she didn't have was enough of anything to be wasteful, which meant she had to plan carefully, which was a kind of problem she understood well. Scarcity and planning were old acquaintances. She made a list on the back of an old envelope, which she had started doing in the second week when she realized that the household management was genuinely her domain now, and she had better treat it like one. Flour, coffee, sugar, cornmeal, any vegetables Chester Holt might have that hadn't been bought up already. She'd send the list back with Hayes when he went. Then she went out to check on the 3 weaker cattle. The first weeks had taught her things she hadn't expected to learn, not just the practical knowledge, how to work a pump, how to manage a wood stove, how to recognize when a fence post was starting to lean before it failed, but things about herself too, about the particular shape of what she could endure and what she couldn't. She could endure the physical difficulty without much complaint. Her body adjusted, her hands roughened. She slept better than she had in years, which she suspected was the result of being genuinely tired rather than merely worn out from worrying. What was harder was the isolation. Not the absence of people, exactly. She was not a woman who needed crowds, but the specific absence of anyone who knew her. Patrice Caldwell had known her a little. Dora Finch, back in St. Louis, had known her the way only a 6-year working partnership can make someone known. Here, she was essentially a stranger to herself as much as anyone else, starting from a position of having been the woman someone didn't want, trying to build a self that had nothing to do with that story. Hayes knew her least of all. He knew what she could do, which was growing, but he did not know who she was, and she was not sure yet that she knew either. She was thinking about this on a Thursday afternoon, about 4 weeks in, when she was at the fence line checking for the loose wire Hayes had mentioned that morning, and Ruth Abernethy's wagon came up the road. Ruth was a short, broad-shouldered woman in her 50s with a reputation, Evelyn had gathered, for knowing everyone's business and not being particularly delicate about it. She had been the first person in town to hire Evelyn sewing, and she had also been, Evelyn suspected, the source of a reasonable amount of commentary about the new woman out at the Hayes Ranch, the nature of which Evelyn could only guess at. "Miss Hartwell," Ruth said, pulling her horse up. "Mrs. Abernethy." Evelyn set down her tools and came to the fence. "I've got 2 more shirts need mending if you're taking work." Ruth handed them down across the fence, wrapped in cloth. "Also, I thought I'd come see how you're getting on, since nobody's seen you in town in 2 weeks. "I've been busy," Evelyn said. "I can see that." Ruth was looking at the fence pliers in Evelyn's hand with an expression Evelyn couldn't entirely decode. "You doing fence work now?" "It needs doing." Ruth made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "What does Hayes say about that?" "He mentioned the wire was loose. I found the loose wire. He's moving cattle." Ruth looked at her for a moment. Then she seemed to reach some internal conclusion, and her expression shifted into something more direct. "People talk," she said, "about you being out here. I expect you know that." "I expect I do," Evelyn said. "I just want you to know. There's some who think it's a poor arrangement, and some who think Hayes is taking advantage, and some who think you've got more sense than anyone's giving you credit for. I'm in the third camp." Evelyn looked at her. "I appreciate that, Mrs. Abernethy." "Ruth," the woman said, "I've brought you shirts. We're past formality." She gathered her reins. "The Hendersons are having a small gathering Saturday evening. Nothing much, just neighbors. You might think about coming. Show people you're a real person and not just a thing to speculate about." Evelyn considered it. "I'll see what Saturday looks like." "Fair enough." Ruth clucked to her horse. "The shirts are fine work, by the way. The seams on that last one held better than the original." She turned the wagon. "Take care of yourself out here, Miss Hartwell. It's easy to disappear in Montana if you're not careful." She drove away. Evelyn watched her go, then picked up the fence pliers and went back to work. She asked Hayes about the Henderson gathering that evening. They were sitting at the table after supper, she with the mending Ruth had brought, he with a worn copy of a land survey map he'd been studying on and off for days. "Jeremiah Henderson," he said, without looking up from the map. "His wife is Clara. They've got land about 3 miles north. He's a decent man. She talks a great deal, but she means well. Ruth Abernethy suggested I go." He looked up at that. "Do you want to?" "I don't know," she said honestly. "I think it might be useful to be known by people here, since I seem to be staying. There was a brief pause. He looked back at the map. "I'll take you Saturday," he said. "You don't have to come." "I know I don't," he said. She looked at him over her mending. He was bent over the map again, his finger tracing something along the creek line. The lamp made the room feel smaller than it was, which she had gotten used to, the way the dark outside made the circle of light inside feel like the whole world. "What are you looking for on that map?" she asked. "Where the webland ends and mine starts," he said. "The boundary's been disputed for years. Webb let it go because he didn't care. But if whoever buys it up decides to press the issue..." He stopped. He folded the map along its crease. "It's something I need to know before the surveyors get here." "When did the dispute start?" "Before I bought the property. The man I bought it from wasn't sure where his eastern boundary actually fell. He thought it was the creek. The county records say it might be 30 yards west of the creek." He looked at her. "If it's 30 yards west, I lose the water rights." She understood the weight of that. She had been keeping the accounts for 3 weeks by this point, and she had a clear picture of what losing the water rights would mean for the cattle, and therefore for everything. "What does your deed say?" she asked. "The creek," he said. "But deeds and county records don't always agree, and county records can be changed by someone with the right connections." "Do you have a lawyer?" He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "There isn't a lawyer within 60 miles, and the one in Billings charges more per hour than I clear in a week." She nodded slowly. She kept sewing. The fire in the stove shifted and settled. "You should write down everything you know about the boundary," she said. "Every conversation you had with the man you bought from, every marker you found, everything you've observed about where the cattle cross and where the water runs. A record, in your own hand, dated." He was quiet for a moment. "Why?" "Because if this goes to a government decision, a written record made before the dispute heated up is worth more than testimony after. It shows you weren't inventing it after the fact." She glanced at him. "It's what I would do if I were fighting for something." He studied her in that way he had. Not long, not making anything of it, just looking with full attention for a moment. "All right," he said. "I'll start it tomorrow." But the Henderson gathering was 23 people in a house that comfortably held 12. Evelyn stood in the doorway for a moment when they arrived, taking in the noise and the heat and the smell of too many people in a space built for fewer, and she felt the familiar calculation she always made in rooms full of strangers. Who was safe, who was watching, who had decided something about her before she opened her mouth. Several people had already decided something. She could see that immediately. There was a cluster of women near the far wall who looked at her with the specific expression that said they had been discussing her and were now assessing whether the reality matched the version they'd constructed. There was an older man by the fireplace, big, white-haired, with a rancher's build gone soft in the middle, who watched Hayes come through the door with an expression that was not unfriendly, but was not uncomplicated either. Hayes moved through the room with the efficiency of a man who can tolerate social situations without requiring them. He introduced her to the Hendersons, Jeremiah, who had a warm handshake and an honest face, and Clara, who talked immediately and continuously and somehow made it welcoming rather than overwhelming, and then stepped back and let her find her own way, which she appreciated more than she could have said. She found her way because she knew how to. She had been managing difficult rooms since before she was 20, and this one was not difficult so much as watchful, which was manageable. The woman who turned out to matter most was named Frances Dunn. She was about Evelyn's age, dark-haired, with a straight-backed posture that suggested either military family or sheer stubbornness, and she came across the room with the direct manner of someone who had decided to skip the preliminary judgments and just see for herself. "You're the Hartwell woman," Frances said. Not unkindly, just direct. "I am," Evelyn said. "I heard about Webb. That was a sorry thing to do." She said it the way someone states a fact. "I'm Frances Dunn. My husband Eli has land west of Hayes's. We've been neighbors of his for 6 years." "He's mentioned you," Evelyn said. He hadn't, actually, but it seemed likely she would have come up at some point. Frances's mouth moved. "No, he hasn't. Colton barely mentions anyone. But that's all right." She seemed to take stock of Evelyn with a quick, comprehensive look. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect? Someone more sorry for herself?" Frances said it without apology. "Given the circumstances." Evelyn considered this. "Being sorry for myself doesn't fix anything," she said. Frances nodded, a single decisive nod, as if this confirmed something she'd suspected. Come with me. Clara's made a decent punch, and I'll introduce you to the Abernethy girl, who's your age and has good sense. The women on the far wall are a lost cause, so don't waste your time. Evelyn went. But the drive back from the Hendersons was quiet in the particular way of drives, after events where a great deal of impression-making has taken place, and both parties need silence to process it. The night was full of stars, and the road was pale in the dark, and the horses moved at a steady walk. Frances Dunn told me about the land trouble, Evelyn said after a while. Hayes glanced at her. What did she tell you? That the man who's put in a claim on the Webb property has money behind him. That he's not someone who needed that land so much as someone who wants to control the water in this section of the territory. She paused. She said the name Garfield. Does that mean something? Hayes was quiet for a beat longer than usual. Harlan Garfield, he said. He's got timber interests up north, and he's been buying up land south and east of the Yellowstone for the past 2 years. Not to work it, to have it. Why would he want land he doesn't intend to work? Water rights sell, Hayes said. If he controls enough water in this region, he can charge every rancher and farmer who needs it, or he can leverage it with the railroad. Either way, he profits without ever setting foot on the land himself. Evelyn thought about that. The night was cold now, the day's heat entirely gone, and she had her coat pulled close. So it's not really about the Webb property, she said. It's about the creek. It was always about the creek, he said. Webb just didn't see it until it was too late. And by then he didn't want to fight. But you do. He didn't answer for a moment. The wagon moved through the dark. I have to, he said. There's nothing left for me if I don't. She looked at the side of his face. He was watching the road, the way he always watched the road, with full attention, as if it might change on him. I started that written record today, he said. Like you said. Good, she said, and meant it, chum. The rains came in late September. Not a gentle introduction. Montana didn't do anything gently, Evelyn was learning. The first real rain in 3 months arrived on a Tuesday afternoon with about 20 minutes of dark building cloud as warning, and then hit the roof of the ranch house like something angry, the kind of rain that came down in sheets and turned the yard to mud in under an hour, and made the creek swell visibly from where she stood in the doorway watching. She stood there for a full minute before she realized she was grinning. Behind her, Hayes came out of the back room where he'd been working and stood beside her in the doorway. Well, he said. Well, she agreed. They stood there together watching the rain, and she was aware of the closeness of it. 2 people in a doorway while the world outside became another country. And she thought about how proximity becomes normal faster than you expect it to, and how normal can become something more without you marking the exact moment it changed. She did not say any of this. The north pasture will flood if this keeps on, Hayes said. Should we move the cattle back south? Tomorrow morning. Tonight the road's too bad. I'll have supper ready early then. She went back inside and he stood in the doorway a while longer, watching the water come down. That night the rain hammered on the roof, and she lay on her cot listening to it, and felt something loosen in her chest that she had been holding tight since the morning in Harlan Crossing, when she'd stood in the street with a letter in her hand and felt the ground shift under her. She had not let herself grieve what she'd lost. Not fully, because grief required time she didn't have, and quiet she hadn't yet found. But something about the rain made it possible. She lay in the dark and let herself feel the full, strange weight of where she was, and how she'd gotten there, and what she'd left behind, and when it passed, it did pass eventually, what replaced it was something steadier. She would not call it peace yet. It was not peace, but it was the absence of panic, which was close enough for now. October moved through its days with the efficiency of a season that knows it has work to do. The grass came back slowly, pale green where it had been dead yellow, and the cattle responded. You could see it in the way they moved, with something that looked almost like ease. Evelyn watched the numbers in the ledger improve incrementally and tried not to get attached to any single week's figures, because she had kept books long enough to know that one good month did not tell you where you stood. She and Hayes had developed something that she would have struggled to name precisely. Not friendship, exactly. It was more functional than friendship, built on the shared language of work and the shorthand that develops between people who spend a great deal of time in close proximity with a common purpose. But it was not impersonal either. There were moments, brief and unremarkable from the outside, that she thought about later. The morning she had cut her hand on a wire edge, and he had taken her hand in both of his to look at it, with complete practicality and no drama whatsoever. And the warmth of his hands had been so specific and present that she had been briefly unable to think about anything else. The evening she had been at the table working on accounts, and had looked up to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't name, and when she met his eyes, he had looked away first, and neither of them had said anything. The Sunday when the rain came back lighter and they had ridden the fence line together and actually talked, more than they usually did, not about the ranch, but about other things. She told him about the seamstress shop in St. Louis, about the way she and Dora had built it from almost nothing over 3 years before the disagreements about money started to pull it apart. He listened without rushing her. He told her, in return, something about growing up in Kentucky and leaving at 17 because there was nothing holding him there and everywhere else seemed better. He said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity, and she understood that self-pity was as foreign to him as it was to her, that they had this in common at least, the instinct to look at difficulty as a thing to move through rather than a thing to mourn. "You never wanted to go back?" she asked. "Nothing to go back to," he said. "Kentucky or anywhere before it." He looked at the fence line, the wire strung between posts he'd driven himself. "Here's the first place that's actually mine, in any sense of the word." She understood that completely, more than he probably knew. The trouble arrived in November. It arrived in the form of a man named Doyle, who was not Garfield himself but was clearly working for him, because he rode up to the ranch on a gray horse in the middle of a Thursday morning and introduced himself as a land agent with papers that he spread on Hayes's kitchen table with the particular confidence of someone who believes the paperwork will do his arguing for him. Evelyn was in the main room when he arrived. She had not been asked to leave, and she did not leave. She sat at the table with her mending and listened. "The claim on the Webb property has been formally registered with the Territorial Land Office," Doyle said. He was a smooth-looking man, city-dressed, with clean hands that had not spent any time on a working ranch. "As the adjacent landowner, you're entitled to formal notice of the claim. That's what I'm here to provide." "I've seen claims before," Hayes said. He was standing across the table from Doyle, not sitting, which was not an accident. "What's the boundary being claimed?" Doyle laid a finger on the map he'd unfolded. "The Webb property extends to the eastern bank of Harlan Creek. The claim is for the full acreage as recorded in the original filing." "The original filing has a dispute attached to it," Hayes said. "Has been since before Webb bought it." "That dispute was never formally filed," Doyle said. "It doesn't appear in the records." "Because Webb didn't file it. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist." Doyle smiled, the polished, patient smile of a man who has had this conversation before and knows how it ends. "Mr. Hayes, my client is prepared to be a reasonable neighbor. He has no intention of disrupting existing water access arrangements that are—" "He has no existing arrangement with me," Hayes said. "The water rights for this section run with my deed. That's the only arrangement that exists." The smile stayed. "The government survey will clarify all of this. Until then, we simply wanted to ensure you were informed." "I'm informed," Hayes said. Doyle gathered his papers, unhurried. He glanced at Evelyn as he folded the map, and there was something in the look, not rude exactly, but the particular blankness with which certain men look at women in rooms where they believe women have no business being. "Ma'am," he said, with meaningless courtesy, and put on his hat and left. The door closed. Hayes stood at the table with his hands flat on the wood, looking at the spot where the map had been. "He's going to try to file against the dispute," he said. "Get the county records changed before the surveyors arrive." "Can he do that?" "With enough money, people find ways." He pushed off the table. "I need to go to Billings." "When?" "As soon as I can arrange it, next week. I need to file the dispute formally, on the record, before Garfield's people can move against it." He stopped. He looked at her. "I'll need you to manage the ranch while I'm gone. 3 days, maybe 4. She looked back at him without flinching. "All right. It's a lot to ask." "You've been asking a lot of me since October," she said. "I've managed." The ghost of something moved across his face, not quite a smile, but close. "You have," he said. He went to Billings the following Monday. He was gone for 4 days, during which Evelyn managed the ranch with the competence of someone who had been paying very close attention for 3 months. The cattle were fed. The weaker animals were checked twice daily. The accounts were kept current. When a section of the barn roof developed a leak the second day, she assessed it herself, determined it was manageable with the materials on hand, climbed up and dealt with it, and came down with a bruise on her knee and a functional roof. When Hayes came back, he came back with a document from the Billings County office confirming that the boundary dispute had been formally entered into the public record. He set it on the table and she read it and looked up at him. "Did you find a lawyer?" "A man who does land work. Not cheap, but not ruinous." He sat down. He looked tired. The road from Billings was 2 hard days in each direction, and he hadn't slept much. She could see that. "He thinks we have a reasonable position. The creek boundary is documented in my deed and in 3 of the oldest survey records from this area. Garfield's claim is based on a single county filing that's newer than any of mine." "Then you should be able to win." "Should," he said. "Winning and ought to win aren't always the same thing." She knew that. She had known it since before she was old enough to have a legal opinion on the matter. She got up and put the coffee on. The weeks after his return settled into something that felt, for the first time, genuinely sustainable. The rains had done what rains do, and the grass had responded, and the cattle were in reasonable shape heading into winter. The accounts showed a deficit that was real but manageable, nothing that one good spring couldn't address, if the spring cooperated. She had begun to know the neighbors. Francis Dunn came by twice, once for practical reasons, and once, she suspected, simply to see how things stood, which was Francis's way of checking on someone without making it seem like concern. Ruth Abernethy sent work regularly. Even Clara Henderson had appeared one afternoon with a jar of preserved plums and a great deal of conversation, and Evelyn had sat with her for an hour at the table and found that under the torrent of words was a woman with genuine warmth and more perceptiveness than the volume of her talking would suggest. She was becoming known. It happened slowly, the way things happen in places where people are cautious about newcomers because the land itself is unforgiving enough without making social errors too. But it was happening. She realized one morning, standing at the kitchen window watching Hayes ride out to check the fence, the winter sky huge and pale above the hills. She was, for the first time in as long as she could remember, somewhere she had chosen to be. Not ended up, not fallen into, not stayed in because the cost of leaving was higher than the cost of staying. She had chosen this place, and she was choosing it again every morning. And that was a different thing entirely from anything she'd had in Missouri. That realization sat with her through the day and into the evening, and when Hayes came in at dusk and they sat at the table with the lamp between them and the cold working at the seams of the house outside, she looked at him over the account ledger and thought about all the things she did not yet know how to say, and all the things that did not need to be said yet because the work itself was saying them, day by day, in the only language she fully trusted. "The Henderson boy's horse threw a shoe," Hayes said, looking at nothing in particular. "I told Jeremiah I'd look at it tomorrow." "That's a half day gone," she said. "They helped me last spring when I couldn't get the cattle to water alone." He picked up his coffee. "You keep track of those things out here." "I'm learning that," she said. He looked at her, just briefly. "You've learned a lot in 4 months," he said. She looked back at her ledger. "I've had a great deal to learn." The fire shifted. The wind moved against the windows. Somewhere out in the dark, the cattle settled into whatever arrangement they made among themselves for the cold, and the territory went on about its enormous business, indifferent and magnificent, and entirely unconcerned with the small human warmth in the low ranch house at the edge of its vastness. Evelyn Hartwell turned a page in the ledger and kept working, and the winter came on. Winter in Montana Territory was not a season so much as an argument. It came in hard from the north in early December and did not relent, and the argument it made was simple, that the land had been here long before any person had thought to claim it and would be here long after, and all the fences and deeds and written records in the world were a small and temporary thing against the weight of it. Evelyn had known cold winters. Missouri got cold. But Missouri's cold had a ceiling to it, a point at which the temperature stopped dropping and stayed manageable, and there were neighbors close enough that you could see smoke from someone else's chimney on the worst mornings. Here the cold had no ceiling she could find. The wind came off the northern plains with nothing to break it for hundreds of miles, and it hit the ranch house like a physical force, working at the gaps in the boards and whistling through the window frames she'd chinked with rags in October, and finding ways through anyway. She woke some mornings in her lean-to room with her breath visible in the air above her and the water in the basin beside her bed frozen solid across the top. She broke the ice with the heel of her hand, washed her face in the cold water below it, and got up. This was not self-punishment. It was simply what there was. Hayes had warned her in October, when the first real cold arrived, and she'd come in one evening with her fingers numb and her face raw. They'd been standing near the stove, her warming her hands, and he'd said, without drama, "November is the easy part." She had not fully believed him. She believed him now. What she had not expected was how the winter would change the shape of the days. The cattle needed more attention in the cold, not less. Ice formed on the water troughs and had to be broken twice daily. The weakest animals required close watching because cold could take a struggling animal faster than almost anything else. The wood supply needed constant tending because the stove ran from before dawn to well past dark, and the woodpile shrank at a rate that made her uncomfortable every time she looked at it. But there was also this. Winter on the ranch compressed everything. There was less to go out to, fewer reasons to be in separate parts of the property, and so they were more consistently in the same rooms for more hours of the day. She noticed things about him that the busier months hadn't given her time to notice. The way he read, if he had a book, he held it close to the lamp and completely forgot the room around him, which she found unexpectedly endearing in a man who otherwise seemed so aware of his surroundings. The way he made decisions, not impulsively, but not slowly either, more like someone who had already turned the options over a dozen times before the conversation happened and arrived at the table knowing where he stood. The way he was, specifically about the accounts. He trusted her completely with them, never second-guessed her figures, never made her feel like a temporary solution to a problem he'd rather be solving himself. Trust, she had found, was not a small thing. She was thinking about trust on a Wednesday morning in mid-December when Hayes came in from the barn with a particular set to his jaw that she had learned meant something was wrong. "What happened?" she asked. He pulled off his gloves. "Lost one of the yearlings in the north field." He said it flat, the way you say things you've already worked through on the walk back to the house. She set down what she was doing. "The gray one that's been thin?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment because there wasn't anything useful to say about it immediately. She'd checked that animal herself 2 days ago and had not liked how it looked, but it had still been on its feet. "How bad does that put us?" she asked. "It's one animal." He poured himself coffee, stood with his back to the stove. "We can absorb one. What I don't want is for it to start a pattern. If the cold doesn't break by January, it usually doesn't," she said. "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." He drank his coffee. She looked at the ledger open on the table. The numbers she knew better now than she'd known the numbers of the seamstress shop, because the seamstress shop had not had the particular urgency of a place where everything was connected to everything else. A dead yearling in December was a lost sale in spring, and a thinner margin against the banknote and billings, and a smaller cushion against whatever March brought. "I want to talk to you about something," she said. He looked at her. He was good at that, looking at her without bracing for it, without the slightly defensive posture some men put on when a woman said, "I want to talk to you." He just looked. "I've been thinking about the spring," she said. "If the surveyors come through before the snow breaks and the boundary ruling comes down in your favor, and I think it will, you're going to have a decision to make." "What decision?" She turned the ledger toward him and pointed to the figures she'd been working on for the past 2 weeks, in the margins and on the back pages. The kind of rough calculation she did when she was trying to see the shape of something before she committed to the idea. "You could run the ranch the way you've been running it," she said. "Keep the same cattle numbers, same operations, stay within what you know you can manage alone. Or," she kept her finger on the page, "you could expand, not recklessly. But the south field past the creek, the land that's been sitting empty because Webb never worked it. If that boundary holds and the water rights are confirmed as yours, that land could carry another 20, maybe 25 head. There's a market in Billings for beef that you're currently not large enough to reach. The railroad buyers want volume. He was looking at the figures. He was quiet. "Where does the capital come from?" he said. "To buy the additional cattle." "There are 2 options," she said. "The bank in Billings, which I don't think is wise given your current note. You'd be carrying too much debt against a single bad season. She paused. Or a private arrangement. He looked up at her. I have $312, she said. What's left of what I got for the seamstress shop. I've had it in a Billings bank account since before I left Missouri, and I haven't touched it because I didn't know yet what I was building toward. She kept her voice even, because this was a practical conversation, and she was going to treat it like one. I would like to invest it in the ranch. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable exactly, but it was weighted. Hayes set down his coffee. Evelyn, he said. She noticed he used her name. He rarely did. Hear me out, she said. I'm not talking about charity. I'm talking about a business arrangement with clear terms, a documented share in the operation, a stated return on investment, everything written down properly so that neither of us is in a position of owing the other something undefined. He was looking at her with that expression she still couldn't fully decode, something between respect and resistance, as if he saw the sense of what she was saying and was fighting it anyway. That's everything you have, he said. I know what it is, she said. I'm the one who saved it. If the survey goes against us, then we both lose, she said. That's what investment means. I understand the risk. She pulled the ledger back to her side. But I don't think the survey will go against us. I've read your deed and your written record and the 3 original survey documents you brought back from Billings. Your position is solid, and I think you know that, but you've been running this place in pure survival mode for so long that you don't trust anything that looks like it might actually work out. He was silent for a long moment. He picked up his coffee and looked at it. Is that what you think? He said. Yes, she said. I think you're a man who's been fighting for the bare minimum for so long that you've forgotten what it would feel like to fight for more than that. He was quiet for so long that she thought she'd said too much. She had a tendency, she knew, to be too direct. It had been a problem before, with Dora, with various clients, with the women on the far wall at the Henderson gathering who had clearly found her blunt. Then he said, You're probably not wrong. She looked at him. About the survival mode, he said. He set the cup down. He looked at the figures in the ledger, the ones she'd been quietly building in the margins for 2 weeks, while he thought she was only doing the accounts. You've been planning this for a while. Since October, she admitted. Why didn't you say anything sooner? Because in October I didn't know if I was staying, she said. And then in November the cold came and I was too busy keeping the pipes from freezing. She almost smiled. And I wanted the numbers to be right before I brought it to you. He looked at the numbers for another long moment. She could see him turning it over. The risk, the logic, the thing underneath both of those that neither of them was saying. I'll think about it, he said. That's all I asked, she said. He thought about it for 4 days, during which the cold continued and one of the water troughs froze through completely, despite her breaking ice on it twice, and the woodpile went down faster than she liked, and Hayes was quiet in the particular way of a man working through something he hasn't finished with yet. On the 5th day, he came in from the barn at mid-morning, which was unusual, and sat down at the table. All right, he said. She looked up from her mending. The arrangement you described, he said. Documented share, stated terms, everything written. I want it to be a genuine partnership, not a loan, not a favor. If we build something here, it should be built on straight ground. Agreed, she said. And I want it clear that your position on the ranch is not contingent on the investment. You stay on the same terms regardless of how the money works out. She looked at him. Why does that matter to you? He met her eyes without hesitation. Because I don't want you to have any reason to doubt that you're here because you chose to be. Not because I need something from you. The words landed simply, without decoration, which was the only way he ever said anything. I know that, she said. I want it in the terms anyway. Then we'll put it in the terms, she said. She found a fresh sheet of paper and they sat at the table and wrote it out together, line by line, the way people build things that are meant to last. Slowly, checking each piece before going on to the next. January came in with 2 weeks of temperatures that made December look mild, and Evelyn stopped being surprised by what she could do when she had to. She did things in January she would not have believed possible in June. She helped pull a calf in a barn so cold her hands went nearly numb before they were done, and the calf survived. She climbed onto the barn roof after an ice storm to clear the load before the structure failed, and came down with a cut on her palm from a metal edge, and ice in her hair, and a barn still standing. She drove the wagon to Harlan Crossing alone on a supply run because Hayes had developed a cough that she did not like the sound of, and she was not going to let him go out in that cold for the sake of his pride. That last one had produced the only real argument they'd had. It was brief, and it was pointed. "I can drive my own wagon," he said. He was sitting by the stove with a blanket over his shoulders, which he had accepted under visible protest, and his voice was rough with the cough. "You can," she said. "You're also running a fever, and the temperature yesterday was 7 degrees, and the road is iced. I've done it and worse." "That is almost certainly true, and also not the point." He looked at her. She looked back. "I've been doing the supply runs longer than you've been in Montana," he said. "And you'll do them again in March," she said. "Sit down." He sat. Not graciously, but he sat. She drove to Harlan Crossing, got what they needed from Chester Holt, had a brief conversation with Ruth Abernethy, who had come into the store and asked after Hayes with the kind of sharp-eyed concern that suggested the neighborhood knew more about what went on at the ranch than either of them had disclosed, and drove home. Hayes was asleep in the chair when she got back, the blanket still around his shoulders. The fire burned down to coals. She built the fire up quietly and put away the supplies and made soup from what they had and set it on the stove. And when he woke an hour later, she had a bowl of it on the table without having said anything about it. He looked at the soup. He looked at her. "Thank you," he said. Just that. "You're welcome," she said. He was better by the end of the week. The letter from the Territorial Land Office arrived in late January. Chester Holt held it for Hayes at the store, and Hayes came back from a supply run with it in his coat pocket and set it on the table in front of her, unopened. She looked at it. She looked at him. "You open it," he said. She was surprised enough that she didn't argue. She picked it up and broke the seal. It was not a resolution. The survey had been postponed. The official language was bureaucratic and bloodless. Due to seasonal constraints and the pending review of multiple overlapping claims in the region, the scheduled survey has been rescheduled to early spring, with decisions to follow within 30 to 60 days of completion. There was a formal notice number and a signature she couldn't read, and nothing else. She put it down. "Spring," she said. "That's what they said in October, too," he said. "Spring." "We hold," she said. He nodded. He picked up the letter, folded it, put it with the others in the box he kept on the shelf above the fireplace. He had a whole collection of them now. Letters from the land office, letters from his lawyer in Billings, letters from the county recorder confirming the formal dispute filing, a paper record of a fight he'd been having for months without a resolution in sight. She watched him put the letter away and thought about what it meant to hold on to something when the holding itself was the only thing being asked of you. She had been doing that her whole life, in various forms, and she was better at it than most people. But she recognized that Hayes had been doing it for years on a scale that she was only beginning to understand, and the weight of it showed if you knew how to look. "I want to start on the South Field in February," she said, "before the ground breaks. Assessing what we'd need to do to run cattle there in the spring." He turned from the shelf. "You said yourself we shouldn't move until the survey." "I said we shouldn't buy cattle until the survey," she said. "I didn't say we shouldn't be ready to move the moment it comes down in our favor. There's a difference between spending money and doing preparation work." She looked at him. "We can have a plan ready, materials assessed, fence work planned, the pasture walked and measured, so that when the ruling comes, we're not spending 6 weeks getting ready, we start the next day." He thought about it. "The South Field's hard going in February," he said. "I know," she said. "I'll go with you." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "All right, first dry week in February." So, the dry week came in the second half of the month, a brief, cold, bright stretch, where the sky cleared and the wind dropped, and the ground was solid enough underfoot to move on without the mud that came with thaw. They went out to the South Field on a Tuesday morning, both of them on horseback, Evelyn with a notebook, and Hayes with the old survey map he'd been studying since October. The South Field was bigger than it had looked from a distance. It stretched east from the creek toward a low ridge of hills that turned blue in winter light, and the grass there, even now in February, was better than she'd expected. The creek ran along its western edge, clear and cold, audible in the silence of the cold morning. She wrote down what she saw. Fence condition, Poor on the eastern side, adequate on the west. Ground quality. Hard now, but likely rich under the frost, given the color of the dead grass. Water access. Good, assuming the creek boundary held. Distance from the barn. Walkable for cattle. Manageable. Hayes moved differently out here than he did around the buildings. He was looser, more at ease, moving through the land with a familiarity that was its own kind of fluency. He showed her where the old fence posts had heaved out of the ground, where the ground dipped in a way that pooled water in spring, where the grass was densest and where it gave way to thin scrub that wouldn't feed anything. They stopped at the eastern fence line, where 3 posts had gone down entirely and lay half buried in the grass. "This is the section closest to the web boundary," he said. She looked across the fence line at the empty land on the other side. It looked just like the land on Hayes's side. Same pale winter grass, same open sky. But the emptiness of it had a different quality. Abandoned land has a way of looking abandoned even when you don't know the story. "Garfield's people haven't done anything with it," she said. "They haven't taken possession yet. Not formally." He looked east toward where the Webb property extended. "But they will. Once the land office processes the claim, they'll move quickly. Garfield doesn't sit on things." "Then we're right to be ready," she said. He looked at her. He was standing about 4 feet away in the cold, his breath visible, his hat brim shading his face from the pale winter sun. She had gotten used to his face over 7 months. The particular lines of it, the way his mouth worked when he was holding something back, the small, involuntary thing that happened around his eyes when something surprised him. "Evelyn," he said. "Why did you stay?" he asked. "I've wondered. You could have left in October when you'd put enough money aside from the sowing. You had options." She looked at the land around them, the creek glinting in the thin light, the dead grass, the fallen fence posts, the enormous pale sky. "Because this was going somewhere," she said, "and everything I left behind wasn't." He was quiet. "That's not entirely it," she said, because she was trying to be honest and half honest wasn't enough. "I stayed because the work made sense, because I was getting better at it, because—" She stopped. She started again. "I left Missouri because I wanted a life that I built myself, not one I fell into because it was available. I was wrong about how that was going to happen the first time, but I wasn't wrong about what I was looking for." He was still looking at her. There was something in his face that was not quite the expression she was used to seeing there. "You found it here?" he asked. "On this particular patch of freezing Montana ground?" "I'm finding it," she said. "There's a difference." Something shifted in the air between them. Not large, not dramatic, but she felt it, the way you feel a change in temperature. Not all at once, but in stages, the gradual awareness that something has moved. He looked away toward the creek. "We should get back," he said. "The light goes fast this time of year." "I know," she said. She closed her notebook. They rode back in silence that was not uncomfortable. The cold pressed in around them, and the horses moved at a steady walk, and the ranch came into view ahead of them. The low square house, the barn in its perpetual better condition, the smoke rising from the stove chimney in a thin column against the enormous sky. She had been in Montana territory for 7 months. She had lost the version of herself that had come here in good faith and been betrayed. She had built another version, harder and more capable, out of the materials available. The ranch was not yet what she'd imagined when she sat in her sister's kitchen in Missouri, reading letters about room to build something real. It was rougher than that, and harder, and more uncertain, and she cared about it more than she had cared about anything in years. March arrived, and with it came Harlan Garfield himself. She was in the yard when his party rode in. 3 men, Garfield at their center, with the unhurried confidence of a man who has always had more resources than the problem he's facing. He was older than she'd imagined, somewhere in his 60s, heavy set but not soft, with a white beard trimmed close and eyes that moved over everything with the same assessing look as a man deciding what to bid. Hayes came out of the barn. He saw who it was, and his face went very still. Garfield pulled up his horse and looked between them. "Hayes," he said. His voice was even and not unfriendly, which she found more unsettling than if he'd been hostile. "I was in the area. Thought we might talk directly." "Get down then," Hayes said. Not warmly, but it wasn't a refusal. Garfield got down. His 2 men stayed on their horses, back a ways. He came forward and his eyes moved to Evelyn with the same assessment he'd given everything else. "This your wife?" he asked. "This is Miss Hartwell," Hayes said. "She's my partner on this operation." Garfield looked at her a beat longer than was comfortable, then back at Hayes. "I appreciate plain speaking, so I'll use it. The survey is coming in April. I've got 3 lawyers and 8 years of land work behind my claim on the Webb property. You've got a deed with a disputed boundary and a formal filing that isn't going to hold up when the county records are examined." "That's your opinion," Hayes said. "It's my lawyer's opinion," Garfield said. "And he's been right before." He looked across the property, the way men do when they're talking about what they want from you. "I'm not here to fight. I'm here because a fight costs time and money on both sides, and I'd rather spend that on something useful. I'm offering a water arrangement, fair market rate for creek access, annual contract, renewable. You keep your operation running and I get the documentation I need for the railroad." "You want me to pay you for water that runs through my land," Hayes said. "I want to settle this before the survey makes it complicated," Garfield said. "Take the arrangement, Hayes. You're not going to win the boundary ruling." The yard was quiet. Evelyn was standing about 6 feet to Hayes's left, and she was aware of how this was being staged. The 2 men on horseback behind, the older, powerful man in front, the implicit weight of money and lawyers and railroad connections arranged to press on a single rancher on a cold March morning. "No," Hayes said. Garfield looked at him. "No to the arrangement," Hayes said, "and no to the idea that I'm not going to win." He held Garfield's gaze without effort. "I've been on this land for 9 years. I have documentation going back to the original survey of this section of the territory. My boundary is the creek, and the creek is my water, and that's what the survey is going to find." Garfield was quiet for a moment. His expression didn't change much. He looked like a man who had received news he'd halfway expected and was already adjusting his plans. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. "That's one way to look at it," Hayes said. Garfield put on his hat, which he'd been holding. He glanced at Evelyn again, that same brief assessment, and she looked back at him without dropping her eyes, because she was not going to give him the satisfaction of looking away. "Think about it," Garfield said. "My offer stands until the surveyors arrive." He mounted and rode out, his 2 men falling in behind him. The sound of hooves on the hard ground faded, then was gone. Hayes stood in the yard for a moment. Then he said, without turning around, "You all right?" "Fine," she said. "Are you?" He turned. He looked, not shaken exactly, more like a man who has just stood at the edge of something and looked down and now knows exactly how far it is. "He's right that it'll get harder," he said. "He's probably right about that," she said. "He's wrong about the rest." He looked at her. "The survey will find what the documents say," she said. "I have read every record you brought back from Billings. I know your case better than you do, in some ways, because I've had more time with the paperwork. You're going to win this." "You sound very certain," he said. "I'm not certain," she said, "but I'm confident, and there's enough difference between those 2 things to stand on." She looked at where Garfield's party had gone, the road empty now in the March light. "He came here to rattle you. Don't let him." Hayes was quiet for a moment. Then something settled in his face. Not relief, but something close to it. The look of a man who has just been handed something he needed and hadn't known how to ask for. "You want to come look at the fence work on the south field?" he said. "I think we can start on the eastern section this week, if the ground holds." She looked at him. The cold was still in the air and the sky was the pale clear blue of early March, and the ranch sat around them exactly as it always did, rough and real and stubbornly present. "Yes," she said, "let's go look at it." They walked together toward the south field, and the land was still and cold around them. And somewhere on the other side of a line drawn on a surveyor's map, the empty Webb property waited, and Harlan Garfield's lawyers were somewhere making their preparations, and none of that stopped them from walking toward the thing they intended to build. She had come to Montana Territory for a life she hadn't known she was looking for. She had found it. She was not going to let anyone take it from her now. The fence work on the south field took 3 weeks. They went out every morning that the ground held, which was most mornings in March, and they worked from first light until the cold or the failing light drove them back. Evelyn learned to drive fence posts alongside Hayes, who showed her once how to set the driver correctly and let her make her own mistakes after that, which was both his teaching method and his basic philosophy she had come to understand. You watched, you tried, you did it wrong, You did it less wrong, and eventually you did it. There was no shortcut built into it. Her arms ached for the first week. She said nothing about this. By the third week, she had developed something approaching technique, and the line of posts they drove on the eastern edge of the south field stood reasonably true. And when Hayes walked it and said it would hold, she felt a satisfaction that was specific and unambiguous. The satisfaction of having made something real with her own hands, something that hadn't existed before and now did. They worked well together in silence, which was its own kind of thing. She had been around people her whole life with whom silence felt like a problem to be solved, a gap that required filling before it became accusatory. Hayes was not like that. His silence was just silence, the absence of words, not the presence of something unspoken. She found she could work beside him for 3 hours without either of them saying anything and feel more companionable than she had felt in most conversations she'd had in her life. The moments of actual conversation were different for being set against that quiet. They had weight somehow. "Tell me about your family," she said one afternoon near the end of the third week. They were at the creek end of the field, tying wire. The creek ran clear and fast at the edge of the pasture, still cold with snowmelt from the hills. He glanced at her. The question clearly caught him sideways. "Not much to tell," he said. "There's always something," she said. He was quiet for a moment, working the wire through the staple. "My father left when I was 11. My mother remarried a man who was all right most of the time. I have a sister I haven't seen in 12 years. Last letter I had from her, she was in Kansas. Do you write to her?" He thought about it. "Not as often as I should." "Then you should write to her," Evelyn said. She kept her eyes on the wire. 12 years is long enough to have let it go too far in one direction. It's not long enough that there's no bringing it back. He looked at her. She could feel it from the side. "Your experience?" he said. "I have a sister in Missouri I don't talk to as much as I should," she said. "And I am aware, every time I don't write, that I am making a choice I might regret." She tied off the wire. "I write anyway. Irregularly. But I write." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll write to her," he said, as if it were a decision he'd just made and was committing to out loud so it couldn't be taken back. "Good," she said. They moved down the fence line. The government surveyors arrived in the second week of April. There were 3 of them. Serious men in practical clothing, with equipment that they treated with the particular care of people who understand that their instruments are more reliable than any human testimony. They set up in Harlan Crossing and spent the first 2 days working along the creek in both directions, which Evelyn knew because Chester Holt reported it to Hayes on his Monday supply run, and because Frances Dunn wrote out specifically to tell them what she'd heard, which was that Garfield's lawyers had also arrived in Harlan Crossing and were staying at the Caldwell house, and were seen having a long dinner with someone from the county land office, whose presence there had not been explained. Frances delivered this information with the clipped efficiency of someone who understood its implications and wanted to make sure they were received correctly. "That's not good," Evelyn said. "No," Frances agreed. "It's not." She looked between Evelyn and Hayes with the particular expression of a woman who has decided to say the useful thing even if it isn't comfortable. "Garfield has more friends in that county office than you do, Colton. That's just a fact." "I know," Hayes said. "Your paperwork is solid, but solid paperwork and a fair reading aren't the same thing." Frances stood with her hat in her hands, turning it the way Hayes turned things when he was thinking. "You might want someone there who can watch the process. Make sure the survey is being run on the actual ground and not on a version of it that's been adjusted for convenience." Hayes looked at Evelyn. She was already thinking the same thing. "I'll go," she said. Both of them looked at her. Frances with interest, Hayes with something more complicated. "The work here," he started, "is manageable for a day," she said. "The fence is done. The cattle are in decent shape. I'll be back by evening." She looked at him directly. "I can read a survey map. I've been reading yours for 4 months. I know what the creek boundary is supposed to look like on paper, and I'll know if the measurement they're recording doesn't match it." Hayes held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, "All right." Frances, who had been watching this exchange with an expression Evelyn didn't try to interpret, nodded once. "I'll come with you," she said. "2 women watching is harder to dismiss than 1. Chasse." They rode to the creek the next morning. The surveyors were working the section closest to the web boundary when Evelyn and Frances arrived. A man named Aldrich, The senior of the three, a careful, deliberate man with a gray mustache and the look of someone who had been doing this work long enough to take it seriously, looked up when they approached but did not tell them to leave, which she had been prepared for and had a response ready. He simply noted their presence and went back to his instrument. Garfield's man Doyle was there. He stood to the side with the particular stillness of someone trying not to look like he was watching everything, and when Evelyn arrived, he met her eyes briefly and then looked away. She watched the surveyor's work. She had Hayes's deed in her coat pocket, along with a hand-copied version of the relevant section of the oldest county survey document, the one predating even the Webb purchase, that she had spent 2 evenings transcribing with precise attention. She did not produce these immediately. She watched, and she read the terrain against what she knew on paper, and she waited. It took about an hour before she saw it. The instrument, the transit, the device Aldrich used to establish the true line, had been set up 10 yards west of where it should have been. It was not a dramatic error. It was the kind of thing that could be a mistake or could be a decision, and she could not yet tell which. But 10 yards west of the creek bank meant 10 yards into Hayes's documented boundary, and if the line was drawn from there, the creek itself would fall on the wrong side of the measured boundary. She walked over to Aldrich. "Mr. Aldrich," she said, "I apologize for interrupting. Could you tell me what point you're using as your baseline reference for this section?" He looked at her with the patience of a man who gets interrupted often and has made his peace with it. "The county stake at the northwest corner of the former Webb property," he said. "It was placed in 1871. "I see," she said. She took the documents from her pocket. "Would you mind looking at something?" He looked at the documents she offered. He was quiet for a moment, reading. His expression did not change much, but something in his posture shifted very slightly. "Where did you get this survey?" he said. It was not an unfriendly question. It was the question of a man who has just found something that complicates his morning. "The Billings County Archive," she said. "It's a copy of the 1868 survey of this section, which predates the Webb filing and the 1871 stake. The creek is identified in that survey as the eastern boundary of the Hayes parcel, called at that time the Morrison parcel, after the original owner." She pointed to the specific line. "If the 1868 survey controls, the baseline should be set to the east bank of the creek, not to the 1871 stake." Aldrich read the document again. He looked at the 1871 stake, which was a rusted iron post half buried in the ground about 10 yards west of the creek bank. He looked at the creek. "The 1871 stake was placed by the county land office," said Doyle, who had come closer without Evelyn noticing. His voice was smooth and even. "It supersedes any prior informal survey." "With respect," Evelyn said, turning slightly toward him but keeping most of her attention on Aldrich. "The 1868 survey was a federal survey, not a county survey. Federal authority in land matters under the homestead framework supersedes county placement, particularly where the county record postdates the federal document by 3 years. She looked at Aldrich. "I believe that's the relevant law. I'd be interested in your reading of it." Aldrich looked at her with an expression that had shifted somewhat. Not impressed exactly, but attentive in a way he hadn't been before. "I'd need to review the full document," he said. "Of course," she said. "I have it here, the whole thing. Take as long as you need." Francis, who had been standing 3 steps behind Evelyn through all of this, said absolutely nothing, which was, Evelyn thought, exactly the right contribution. Doyle said, "This is irregular." Aldrich said, "So is a county stake that contradicts a federal survey." He said it mildly, without heat. He was looking at the document. "I'll need to suspend measurement for today while I review the baseline question. We'll resume tomorrow morning." Doyle's composure held, but just barely. "Mr. Aldrich, my client has commitments." "Your client's commitments," Aldrich said, still mildly, "are not my concern. The accuracy of this survey is—" He folded the document carefully. "I'll return this to you tomorrow, Miss Hartwell," she said. "Evelyn Hartwell." "Miss Hartwell." He nodded, which she took as both acknowledgement and dismissal. She and Francis rode back to the ranch. They were a 1/4 mile from the house when Francis said, "Where did you learn to do that?" "Do what?" Evelyn said. "Talk to a man like Aldrich like you had every right to be there." Evelyn thought about it honestly. "I ran a business for 6 years," she said. "Customers, suppliers, the man from the tax office who didn't think a woman could manage accounts. You learn to walk into rooms and not apologize for being in them. Frances was quiet for a moment. Colton's going to ask you what happened. I'll tell him, she said. He's going to have a hard time sitting still tonight, knowing the survey's suspended. I know, Evelyn said. I'll keep him busy with the Southfield accounts. Frances made the sound that was not quite a laugh, but was close. You've gotten good at managing that man. I'm not managing him, Evelyn said. I'm just paying attention. Hayes was waiting in the yard when they rode in. He read their faces before either of them spoke. Tell me, he said. She told him. All of it, in the same plain sequence it had happened. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things about him she had come to value more than she could have explained. The way he gave his full attention to information and did not try to shape it while it was still being given to him. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. You had that survey document in your pocket, he said. I've had it in my pocket for 2 days, she said. I didn't know exactly when I'd need it. He looked at her. The afternoon light was going flat and gold, the way it did in April when the sky finally started to remember it could be more than just pale. Evelyn, he said. Then he stopped. It's not decided yet, she said. Aldrich still has to rule on the baseline question. Garfield's lawyers will push back. It's not over. I know, he said. That's not... He stopped again. He looked like a man trying to find the right shape for something he didn't have a ready-made word for. Thank you, he said. Which was not the word he'd been looking for, she thought, but it was the one he trusted enough to use. We built this together, she said. I'm not going to watch someone take it. He nodded once. He looked at the south field, which was green now with new spring grass. The fence posts they'd driven together standing straight along the eastern edge, the creek running just visible beyond. I'm going to write that letter to my sister tonight, he said. She looked at him. It was, on the surface, a non sequitur. She understood it perfectly. Good, she said. Aldrich's decision came 4 days later. He delivered it in person, which Chester Holt told them afterward was not standard procedure, and suggested the senior surveyor had taken the matter more seriously than a typical boundary question warranted. He rode out to the ranch on a Thursday morning and handed Hayes a formal document with the measured boundary recorded in the official notation of the Territorial Survey Service. The boundary was the eastern bank of Harlan Creek. Hayes read it twice. Then he set it on the table. Evelyn stood across from him and watched his face go through something she had rarely seen on it. Not relief, exactly, because relief implied that things had been uncertain in his body the way they'd been uncertain on paper, and she thought he had never quite let himself believe the worst. It was more like a long-held breath finally released, the sound a man makes when he sets down something he's been carrying for years without naming the weight. It's done, he said. Not entirely, she said. Garfield can contest it. He can try. Hayes looked at the document again. Aldrich noted in his findings that the 1868 Federal Survey controls. That's not easy to argue past. He looked up at her. His lawyers will tell him it's not worth the cost. She thought that was probably right. Garfield was a man who measured things against their returns. A prolonged legal fight over a boundary that had now been formally measured and documented by a federal surveyor was not a good use of his resources when there were easier properties to pursue. She sat down. She was tired in a way she hadn't let herself feel in weeks, the kind of tired that arrives after a sustained effort stops requiring your full attention. We need to buy cattle, she said. He almost laughed. It was a real sound caught somewhere between surprise and genuine amusement. She had heard it twice before, and both times it had been the result of her doing something thoroughly unexpected. We just won the boundary ruling, he said. You want to talk about cattle? The south field is ready, she said. The grass is coming in. If we wait too long, the summer sales will have picked over the best stock. She opened the ledger. I've been looking at a man named Pruitt in Billings who runs a respectable breeding operation. His prices are fair and his cattle are documented healthy. Hayes sat down across from her. He was still containing that almost laugh somewhere in his expression. 20 head to start, she said. With my capital and what we can draw from the spring operating account, we can do it without touching the banknote. She turned the ledger toward him. Look at the numbers. He looked at the numbers. He looked at her. You've been planning this since February, he said. I've been planning this since October, she said. I just needed the boundary to be settled first. He shook his head slowly, not in disagreement, but in the way people do when they are looking at something they didn't quite anticipate and are trying to recalibrate. All right, he said. 20 head. We go to Billings next week. I'll write to Pruitt today, she said. She was already reaching for the pen. Yeah. They went to Billings together on a Thursday, which meant 2 days on the road and 2 nights at a decent hotel that was the first comfortable accommodation Evelyn had experienced since arriving in Montana territory almost a year ago. She did not make a ceremony of this. She slept for 9 hours the first night and woke feeling more rested than she had since the previous summer. Pruitt's operation was east of Billings, a well-managed spread with clean facilities and cattle that were visibly in good condition. He was a laconic man in his 50s who conducted business efficiently and without embellishment, which she appreciated. They spent 3 hours looking at stock and another hour at his kitchen table going over the numbers, and they came away with a purchase agreement for 22 head. She'd found 2 more that were good enough to include to be delivered to the Hayes Ranch in May. Hayes had let her take the lead in the negotiation, which had surprised Pruitt, and she suspected had surprised Hayes slightly as well. But she had studied the prices, and she knew what was fair, and she brought the final number down 11% from Pruitt's opening figure through the simple method of knowing the market better than he expected her to and being willing to stand quietly on a number until the discomfort of silence did the work. In the wagon on the road back, Hayes was quiet for a long time before he said, "You saved us about $40 in there." "43, she said. "I wouldn't have gotten that." "You might have," she said. "You just would have done it differently." He looked at the road. "I've been running this place alone for 9 years, he said. "I thought I knew how." "You do know how," she said. "You kept it alive through a drought and a land dispute and a Montana winter with a stranger in the lean-to room. That's not nothing." He looked at her. "You were never a stranger," he said. "Not after the first week." She looked back at the road. "No," she said. "I suppose I wasn't." There was a silence that was different from their usual silences, warmer, maybe, or more honest about what it contained. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask it." "The arrangement we put in writing in January," he said. "The partnership terms. What about them?" He was quiet for a moment. She could see him finding the shape of the words, the way he always did when he was saying something that mattered. "I'd like to change them," he said. She looked at him. "Not the terms," he said quickly. "Not the business terms. Those are—" He stopped. He started again. "I mean, I'd like it if the arrangement between us were something different from a business arrangement." He looked at the road for a moment, then at her. "I'm not good at this. I want you to know that before I say the rest of it." "I know you're not good at it," she said. "Say the rest anyway." He said it. Not elaborately, not with the kind of language that belonged in a letter from a man who didn't know her, promising things he couldn't see yet. He said it the way he said everything that mattered, plainly, directly, with the specific weight of a man who does not use words carelessly and therefore means each one. He said he had watched her build herself into this place over 9 months, into the work, into the land, into something he had long since stopped being able to imagine without her in it. He said he had not known what to do with that for most of those 9 months, and was not certain he knew now, but that he was certain enough of the thing itself to say it out loud, which was not something he had been able to do before. He said he loved her. He said it the way you say something that is simply true. She listened to the whole of it. She looked at the road and at the wide spring sky above the Montana plains, and at the man beside her who had offered her a job and a roof when she had nothing, who had given her the accounts because she was capable, who had let her stand in a surveyor's field with a document in her pocket without asking whether she knew what she was doing. "I'm not easy," she said when he'd finished. "You know that by now." "I know," he said. "I have opinions about everything, and I'm usually right about half of them and convinced I'm right about all of them." "I know that too," he said. There was something at the edge of his voice that was almost humor. "And I'm not going to become someone who defers to you because it's simpler," she said. "On the ranch or anywhere else." "I wouldn't want you to," he said. "Evelyn, I know exactly who you are. That's the point." She looked at him. He looked back, waiting, with the patience of a man who has made his position clear and is prepared to wait as long as it takes for the other person to make theirs. "All right," she said. All right, he repeated. Is that... It means yes, she said. I'm not good at this either. That's about as well as I can say it. He reached across the wagon seat and took her hand, and she let him, and they rode the rest of the way back toward Harlan Crossing in a silence that was as comfortable as any they'd shared, which by now was saying a great deal. They were married in June, on a Saturday, at the Henderson property, because Clara Henderson had offered it before anyone asked, and the offer had been made with such genuine warmth that refusing it would have been unkind. Jeremiah Henderson served as witness. Frances Dunn served as the other. Ruth Abernethy came and cried freely, which she said she always did at weddings and was not embarrassed about. Chester Holt came and stood in the back and shook Hayes's hand afterward with the solid, understated warmth of a man who had watched all of this from the beginning and was glad about how it had gone. It was not an elaborate ceremony. The justice of the peace was a man named Croft, who did the thing efficiently and sincerely. And Evelyn wore the best of her 3 dresses, which was not a wedding dress by any ordinary measure, but was clean and fit her well. And Hayes wore a coat she had mended so carefully that you could not find where it had been torn if you didn't know where to look. She had written to her sister in Missouri 2 weeks before. The letter had not arrived yet, and she knew it would be months before one could come back. And by then the fact of the wedding would be old news, and the sister's response would be to a thing already done. She had accepted this. The distance between where she was and where she had come from was not something that could be shortened by wanting it shorter. But she had written. That was something. After the ceremony, when the small gathering had relaxed into food and conversation, and the late afternoon light had gone golden over the Henderson fields, Evelyn stood at the fence line where the yard ended and the open land began, with a cup of something that had been described as lemonade and was mostly lemon, and she looked at the landscape that had been foreign to her 11 months ago and was not foreign anymore. Frances came and stood beside her. "Well," Frances said. "Well," Evelyn said, "you look like you're thinking hard about something." "I'm thinking about the cattle delivery," Evelyn said. "The 22 head from Pruitt are coming next week, and I want to make sure the Southfield fencing is checked before they arrive." Frances stared at her. Evelyn smiled. It was a real smile, which Frances had observed were less common than they should be in a woman who had plenty to smile about, but when they appeared, they were worth the wait. "I'm also thinking," Evelyn said, "that a year ago I stood in front of Chester Holt's store with a letter in my hand and no idea what came next. And now I'm standing here. Here being a field in Montana at your own wedding," Frances said. "Here being exactly where I chose to be," Evelyn said. Frances was quiet for a moment. Across the yard, Hayes was talking to Jeremiah Henderson, and whatever Henderson was saying had produced a rare full laugh from Hayes, which was the kind of sound that made the people around him look over in surprise and then smile without knowing they were going to. "He's a good man," Frances said. "I know," Evelyn said. "I spent 9 months finding that out. Do you think you'll stay?" The question was genuine. Frances had always asked genuine questions, which was why Evelyn had liked her from the beginning. "I'm going to build an orchard," Evelyn said, "on the east side of the south field, past the new fence. Apples, mostly, and maybe some plum. The soil there is good, and the creek gives enough moisture." She looked at the distant hills going blue in the evening light. "You don't plant an orchard if you're planning to leave." Frances nodded. "No," she said, "you don't." Across the yard, Hayes looked up from his conversation with Henderson and found her across the distance between them, the way he had developed the habit of doing, a brief checking in that was more reflex than intention by now, the way you make sure without thinking of something that matters. She raised her cup slightly in his direction. He nodded once. She turned back to the hills and the land and the enormous Montana sky going pink at its edges, and she thought, this is what it feels like when you stop looking for the life you were supposed to have and start building the one that's actually yours. It felt, she thought, like ground under her feet. Solid, imperfect, completely real, and entirely worth every mile she'd come to find it. The apple trees went in the ground in the autumn of 1881. Evelyn ordered the saplings from a nursery in Oregon through Chester Holt, who had developed the habit of setting aside catalog pages he thought might interest her, a small service he performed without comment, and which she repaid by doing his shop accounts twice a year at no charge. The saplings arrived in late September, bundled in damp burlap, 12 of them, smaller than she'd expected and more fragile looking than she liked. She and Hayes planted them in a single long day, working from the eastern fence line inward, spacing them the way the nursery pamphlet specified, and then a little wider, because she had decided that if they were going to do this, they were going to do it with enough room for the trees to become what they were supposed to become. Hayes tamped the soil around the last one and stood up and looked at the row. "They look like sticks," he said. "They are sticks," she said, "for about 3 years. And then they're trees." She put her hands on her lower back and stretched. "You're not a patient man for someone who ranches." "I'm patient with things I can do something about," he said. "Trees I just have to watch." "That's the point," she said. "Some things you can only watch." He looked at her sideways. She was already walking back toward the house, and he followed, and behind them the 12 young apple trees stood in their new earth in the September light, small and unpromising and full of a future neither of them would be fully present for, which was exactly the kind of thing worth planting anyway. The 22 cattle from Pruitt settled into the south field through the summer and proved themselves a sound investment. They were hardy animals, well-tempered, and they took to the pasture quickly, which Evelyn took as a confirmation of her read on Pruitt's operation. By autumn, the herd stood at 81 head, the original 63 that had survived the drought and the losses of the previous year, plus the 22 new additions, minus the 3 they'd sold at the Billings market in August at prices that were better than Hayes had projected. She did not say "I told you so" about the prices, but she thought it. The banknote in Billings was paid off in November, 11 months ahead of schedule. She carried the paid receipt home in her coat pocket and set it on the table in front of Hayes that evening without ceremony. He picked it up and read it and set it back down. "How?" he said. "The August sale, the sewing income, and the money I saved us on the Pruitt negotiation compounded across the operating year," she said. "I've been running the numbers since July. We had enough." She sat down. "I should have told you sooner. I wanted to be certain first." He looked at the receipt again. There was something in his face she recognized by now. The particular expression of a man who has been braced for difficulty for so long that good news arrives like an unfamiliar language and takes a moment to translate. "We're free of it," he said. "We're free of it," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to expand the barn." She looked at him. "I know," he said. "I know we just paid off a note, and you're going to tell me this isn't the moment to take on a new expense." "I was going to say," she said, "that I've been thinking the same thing since August, and I've already got a materials estimate in the ledger." She turned the ledger toward him and pointed. "Here." He looked at the figure. He looked at her. "You're going to be very difficult to live with for the rest of my life," he said. "You had 8 months to figure that out before you married me," she said. He picked up the ledger and read the estimate. It was a fair number, she knew, because she had gotten 3 separate opinions from men who did this kind of work, and had taken the middle figure and then shaved it by accounting for the lumber they could cut themselves from the North Ridge. "Spring," he said. "Spring," she agreed. The winter of 1882 was hard but manageable, which was the best you could say about Montana winters, and which was enough. They had laid in sufficient wood, sufficient feed, sufficient provisions, and they had the experience of the previous 2 winters to know what the house needed and where it was going to fail and how to address it before it became a crisis rather than after. She had also, by this point, chinked every gap in the walls she could find, which had made a meaningful difference in the lean-to room and a marginal difference in the main house, which had structural opinions about the wind that no amount of chinking was going to fully resolve. They managed. What she had not anticipated about her second winter as Evelyn Hayes, as opposed to Evelyn Hartwell, though she still signed the accounts both ways out of a stubbornness she didn't feel obliged to explain, was how differently she experienced the isolation from how she had experienced it the first year. The first winter, the silence had pressed on her, a reminder of everything absent. This winter, it was simply what the season sounded like. She had learned, somewhere in the intervening year, to stop measuring where she was against where she was not. That was not a small thing. She was aware of that. Francis Dunn came by twice during the winter, which required genuine effort given the road conditions, and Evelyn understood these visits as what they were: the deliberate maintenance of a friendship by a woman who understood that things left untended in Montana winters had a way of not surviving until spring. She received them accordingly, and made sure there was always coffee and always enough time, and told Frances things she didn't tell anyone else, which was the actual content of a friendship rather than its form. On one of those visits in February, Frances said, "You're different from when you came." "I'd be worried if I weren't," Evelyn said. "I mean specifically," Frances said. She was warming her hands around her cup. "You came here when Hayes first brought you to the Henderson gathering. You were watching the room the whole time, calculating who was safe." "I was." "You don't do that anymore." Evelyn thought about it. "No," she said. "I suppose I don't." "Because you trust the people here?" "Because I'm one of the people here," Evelyn said. "There's a difference." She looked at the window, the white outside it. "When you're calculating who's safe, it's because you might have to leave. When you're not, it's because you're not going anywhere." Frances was quiet for a moment. "That took you about a year and a half. Some people never get there," Evelyn said. "I've seen it. People who live somewhere their whole lives and are still measuring the room." She picked up her own cup. "I got lucky. I found something worth staying for before I decided to leave." "Hayes," Frances said. "The work," Evelyn said. "Hayes is part of it, but it's all of it together. The land, the animals, the accounts, the fence line, the 12 miserable sticks I planted in September that are going to be apple trees whether they like it or not." She almost smiled. "You can't leave something you've built your hands into." Frances looked at her with the expression she got when she was thinking something she was deciding whether to say. "What?" Evelyn said. "Nothing," Frances said. "Only that I'm glad you missed your original wagon stop." Evelyn set down her cup. "I didn't miss it," she said. "I got exactly where I was going, just not by the road I expected." The barn expansion happened in May, as planned, and it was not a smooth process. The lumber arrived 3 days late. One of the men Hayes had hired for the framing work turned out to have overstated his experience with a confidence that was not borne out by his actual carpentry, and it rained for 4 straight days in the middle of the project, which turned the work site to mud and set the schedule back a week. Evelyn managed the accounts for the project and also, on the 3rd day of rain, climbed onto the partially framed structure with Hayes to cover the exposed sections with canvas so the materials wouldn't warp, which the inexperienced carpenter watched from below with an expression of visible discomfort. "You don't have to do that," Hayes said when she was up beside him on the frame, working the canvas. "I know," she said. He handed her a rope end without further comment. They finished the barn in June. It was larger than the original by a third, with better ventilation and a proper hayloft that would hold twice what the old structure had managed. Hayes stood in the middle of it on the day they finished and looked up at the new roof with the expression of a man who is adding something up and finding the total larger than he expected. "This is a real operation now," he said. "It was a real operation before," she said. "Now it looks like one." He looked at her. "Is there a difference?" "To the people on the outside," she said. "Yes. People look at what they can see." She looked up at the hayloft, the clean new wood of it. "The bank in Billings looks at a barn like this and they see a borrower worth lending to. Cattle buyers from the railroad look at it and they take you seriously before you open your mouth." She looked back at him. "It matters." "You think like a merchant," he said. It was not a criticism. "I was a merchant," she said. "For 6 years." She looked around the barn. "You think like a rancher. That's why we work." He was quiet for a moment, the way he got when something had landed differently than the surface of it suggested. "Yes," he said. "That's why." In the summer of 1883, 3 years after a woman had stepped off a freight wagon in Harlan Crossing with $31 and a letter she wished she'd never had to read, the Hayes Ranch sold 104 head of cattle to a railroad buyer out of Chicago at the Billings market, which was the largest single sale either of them had made and which produced a figure in the account ledger that Evelyn looked at for a long moment before writing it down, not because she didn't believe it, but because she wanted to mark the fact of it in her own mind. She had done the projection for this outcome 14 months earlier, on a February evening by lamplight, and Hayes had looked at her numbers and said that seems ambitious in the tone of a man who hoped she was right and was afraid to say so. She was right. The ride back from Billings was 2 days, and she spent most of it thinking about what came next, which was the particular gift and burden of being someone who always knew what came next. Hayes rode beside her and did not press her on the silence, which was also his particular gift. On the second day, coming down from the ridge where Harlan Crossing first became visible in the distance, the scatter of buildings, the thread of road, the creek glinting in the afternoon light, she stopped her horse. He stopped beside her. "I want to hire a proper hand," she said. "Not seasonal, a full-time hand, someone who can take on more of the cattle management so that you can focus on the herd improvement work we've been talking about." She looked at the settlement below. "And I want to talk to Agnes at the post office about whether there's interest in a sewing cooperative. 3 or 4 women working together, sharing the large orders, splitting the income. There's enough demand from the ranches and the new homesteads coming in that one person can't service it alone." Hayes looked at her. "I can't run both things at the full level they need," she said. "The ranch accounts are a full job. The sewing is a full job. If I give the sewing a structure that runs itself, I can focus on the ranch and the sewing still gets done." "You'd give up the sewing?" he said. "I'd give up doing it alone," she said. "It's different." She looked down at the settlement. Agnes Pruitt's daughter is 17 and has good hands and no particular direction. Ruth Abernethy's niece came out last spring and she's been taking in mending at the Caldwell house for 3 months. There are enough of them. Hayes thought about it. "And you'd run the cooperative." "I'd set it up and set it loose," she said. "I don't want to manage people. I want to build the structure and let capable women fill it." He looked at her with the particular expression that was still, after 2 years of marriage, one she hadn't fully learned to decode, something that was part recognition and part something else, something she had decided over time was simply what it looked like when he saw her clearly and was glad about what he saw. "You've been thinking about this for a while," he said. "Since February," she said. "You always say that." "Because I think in February," she said. "The winters are long, and there's nothing else to do." He almost laughed. She nudged her horse forward, and they rode down toward Harlan Crossing together, and behind them the wide Montana sky held everything in its indifferent, magnificent way. The sewing cooperative began with 4 women and a handwritten agreement that Evelyn drafted on a Sunday afternoon and had each of them sign because she had learned the hard way in Missouri that even the most congenial working arrangements needed to be written down before they became something to argue about. Agnes at the post office let them use the back room twice a week. By autumn, they had 7 women and a waiting list of orders, and Evelyn had stepped back from the day-to-day work entirely and taken on only the accounts, which she could do in an evening. It was not perfect. There were disagreements about pricing, and one of the women left after 3 months over a dispute about a shared commission that Evelyn suspected was more about personal friction than money. But it ran. It ran without her having to hold it up, which was the actual measure of whether you had built something or just done something. The full-time hand they hired was a young man named Cal, 22, who had come west from Ohio and had genuine instincts with cattle that Hayes recognized immediately, and Evelyn confirmed by watching him work for 2 weeks before committing to the hire. He was quiet and competent and did not treat her differently because she was the rancher's wife, which she required before she would agree to the arrangement. "He's good," Hayes said, after Cal's 3rd week. "He is," she agreed. "He's going to want a raise in 6 months." "How do you know?" "Because he's smart enough to know what he's worth," she said. "Give it to him before he asks. It's cheaper than losing him and hiring again." Hayes gave Cal the raise in 5 months before he asked. Cal stayed for the next 7 years, which was as far ahead as the story of this particular ranch needed to go. But the point stood. The apple trees bloomed for the first time in the spring of 1884. She almost missed it. She was at the table with the quarterly accounts when Hayes came to the door of the house and said simply, "Come and look at this." She followed him across the yard and through the gate to the south field and to the eastern fence line, and the 12 trees that had been sticks in September of 1881 were standing, properly standing, with actual height and actual branches, and they were covered in white blossoms, each one small and unremarkable on its own, and collectively something that stopped the breath. She stood and looked at them. "Well," she said. "3 years," he said. "I told you 3 years." "You did," he said. He was standing beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the spring morning air. "You were right." "I usually am," she said. "About half of it." He made the sound that was a laugh. She looked at the blossoms, the white of them against the blue April sky, the creek running behind them with its steady noise, the south field green and full with the cattle moving in it at a distance. She had come here with nothing. That was the plain fact of it, and she had never tried to dress it up into something more useful sounding. She had come with nothing, and she had been left with less, and she had stayed anyway because the alternative was returning to a life she had already decided was not the life she was going to live. What she had found here was not what she had been promised. She had been promised, by Marcus Webb's letters, by her own hopes, by the particular story women were often handed about what the frontier meant for them, a place in someone else's narrative, a supporting role in a life that was already underway. She had arrived to find that role withdrawn, and had been furious and frightened in that street in Harlan Crossing, and had then, slowly and through the daily practice of getting up and working, built something that was entirely her own. Not alone. That was the part that mattered. She had built it in partnership with a man who had seen her as a capable person from the first week, and had never revised that assessment downward. Not once. Not when she failed, and not when she succeeded. Who had let her take the accounts because she was better at them? Who had stood beside her at a survey site while she read maps to a federal official and had not felt the need to explain or justify her presence? Who had taken her hand in a wagon outside Billings and said what he meant, plainly, without performance? She had also built it in partnership with women, Frances, Ruth, Agnes, Clara Henderson, who talked too much and meant every word, who had made a community around her before she knew she was being included, who had treated her eventual belonging not as a gift they were bestowing, but as a fact they were waiting for her to catch up to. And she had built it on her own terms. That was the thing she returned to when she thought about what the years added up to. She had not become a smaller version of herself in order to fit into the life available. She had stayed fully herself, difficult and opinionated and direct and imperfect, and had found that this particular piece of the world, this hard and demanding and enormous territory, had room for that. Not easily, not without friction, not without the winter mornings when the basin water was frozen and the cattle needed tending and everything hurt, and she thought, why is this the life I chose? Those mornings existed and always had, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. But she had chosen it. Every day she had chosen it, and that was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. Hayes sat down beside her on the fence rail at the edge of the orchard, the fence they had built together with cold hands in a February that felt like a different lifetime. And they looked at the blossoming trees and the south field and the creek and the hills beyond. I've been thinking, he said. Dangerous, she said. About the north section, he said. Past the ridge. There's good grass there that we haven't been using. If we push the fence line north, show me on the map tonight, she said. I haven't drawn it out yet. Draw it out and show me tonight, she said. I'll run the numbers tomorrow. He was quiet for a moment, a comfortable quiet, one of hundreds they had accumulated over the years, the way you accumulate things in a house where people actually live, not because you sought them out, but because they kept happening, and you kept being glad they did. Evelyn, he said. Are you happy? It was not a question he asked often. He was not a man given to checking in on abstract states of being. The fact that he asked it meant he had been thinking about it, probably for some time. She looked at the orchard, the blossoms, the field. I'm content, she said, which is better than happy. Happy is temporary. Content is something you build. He considered this. And you've built it. We've built it, she said. I keep saying this, and you keep making it singular. He looked at her. There was something in his face that was not quite an apology and not quite a smile and was exactly right. We've built it, he said. She looked at the land around them, the fence posts standing true, the orchard in bloom, the creek running its boundary with its decade-long indifference to everything but gravity, the cattle in the south field, the barn visible from here with its new third that had taken 3 weeks and 4 days of rain and one incompetent carpenter to get right. The ranch house with its perpetually leaning porch and its window frames she had chinked 6 times, and would probably chink again next autumn. None of it was what she had pictured when she sat in her sister's kitchen in Missouri and read about room to build something real. It was harder than that, and less predictable, and more hers. A woman who arrives at a place with nothing discovers, if she is paying attention, that nothing is not the same as the beginning. Nothing is just where you start. What you do from there is the story. She had been paying attention. Behind them, somewhere in the field, one of the cattle made a sound that was emphatic and without context, the way cattle sounds always were. The creek ran. The blossoms on the 12 apple trees held for now against the April breeze, not permanently, not even for long, but for this morning. That was enough for a morning. The rest of it, the accounts to be done, the north section to consider, the cooperative summer schedule, the letter she owed her sister, the 10,000 ordinary tasks that made up an actual life rather than an imagined one, would be there when she got back to the house. For now she sat on the fence rail beside the man she had chosen and the land she had fought for, in the territory that had seemed once impossible to survive. She had not just survived it, she had made it home. End of part 5. End of story.